To all those who joined on a Saturday evening, thank you so much. I can see a lovely, lovely audience here from all parts of the world. Thank you so much for coming in. Um, Questions will be at the end of the session. I will not take too long. We will have a little more time for Q&A that way. Happy to take questions after the session is over. We're here today to talk about uh, what I absolutely refuse to call the destructive work of John Forbes Watson. Uh, I would rather have us talking about the intent, impact, and the importance of uh, his very, very epic work, The Textile Manufactures of India. But before we plunge into what this is, a little bit about who John Forbes Watson was. Um, Trained as a doctor, the Scotsman had a stint in Mumbai's Grant Medical College as an army surgeon. And when he fell ill, he went back to UK, he went back to Britain. And one of the key roles he assumed back home was as the reporter of the products of India at the India Museum in London. Now, a little bit of context to what the India Museum was really, what it was about, is that when the East India Company came into India and into the subcontinent, they came in as traders. And among the articles of trade were a lot of textiles and craft pieces. So there was a lot of export of textiles that was taking place from the subcontinent. And when I say subcontinent, I will include countries like Bhutan, Burma, Pakistan, Bangladesh, uh, India, the whole of India as we know it today, and also includes perhaps some parts of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan as well. And the reason I specify this is because the textile manufacturers of India, while it says India, includes samples from all of these countries as well, because the British saw this as one geographical entity. Now, coming back to this, a lot of the textiles that were collected from India through trade, as well as those that were acquired through the various industrial exhibitions that were happening, including the one that happened in Paris in 1855, was stored at the India Museum. And John Forbes Watson was known for his exceptional organizing skills, and he was tasked with the idea of reorganizing the India Museum. For those who do not know, the India Museum eventually became the Kensington Museum and later what we now know as the Victoria and Albert or the V&A Museum, which probably even today houses some of the best textile samples from the subcontinent. Also, some of the best scholarship on Indian textiles comes from the curators and the people at the V&A Museum. So a fairly important museum for India even today. So John Forbes Watson was tasked with reorganizing the India Museum. And one of the key tasks given to him was to compile this work that changed the destiny of the handloom sector in India. And before we plunge into that, could I have the next slide? The Textile Manufactures of India, as the caption here says, is a series of 18 volumes, of which 20 sets were made. So we're talking 20 sets of 18 volumes each. 17 were given to British manufacturers and 3 to Indian manufacturers. Before we move on, a little bit on why these books were necessary. We have the move from the East India Company to the British Crown in India. And what was noticed was that India was exporting everything. India was selling everything from silk to cotton to to cloth, to ivory, spices. Everything was going out of India to Britain, and India was not buying anything. So there was a lot of foreign exchange drainage that was happening as far as Britain was concerned. And this was something they wanted to rectify, was part one of the reason. The other part was, of course, that by the mid 19th century, you have the setting up of spinning mills across England, as well as 1854, Bombay has its first spinning mill being set up as well. So uh, what was seen then was that is there any way in which we can actually sell cloth to India so that our spinning mills could actually start earning a good revenue, and India could actually be buying something from us because that's the best we can give India. With this basic idea in mind, Forbes Watson was tasked with the with the job of compiling this very seminal work on Indian textiles. Next slide, please. Now, John Forbes Watson had a brief introduction to India and its people during his stint in Bombay. And what he did was really very simple. And probably one of the reasons why his name is associated with the destruction of Indian textiles. And although probably back then this was not how it was viewed. Now, as I told you earlier, the India Museum was sitting with a lot of Indian textiles in its, uh, stockpile. And what Watson did then was that he came up with the strategy, which was the economic strategy as well as the political strategy in a sense on how to shift the balance of trade in favor of Britain using textiles. So what he did was he sat with the entire textile collection that was at the disposal of the India Museum, curated 700 of these, which he thought could be replicated very easily on the mills in Lancashire and Manchester, and compiled product mood boards. In today's term, we would call these product mood boards, and I'll show you why I call them product mood boards. But what Watson was essentially doing is probably in today's language, what we would call data mining. He was sitting with this huge amount of data. He had to sift through all of this data, select what was most useful, and put it out there, analyze the impact and the importance of this data, and put it together in such a way that the government could actually have pan out actionable strategies based on his compilation. So you have him sitting with these textiles, and he and his team cut these into swatches. Every single textile was cut into swatches of two sizes to fill up these 20 sets of 18 volumes each. Like I said earlier, 17 were to distribute it between the in the British to the British manufacturers, and 3 were to be given to India because they felt it was only fair that the fledgling spinning mills in India also got work and benefited from this work. The volumes were categorized based on fabric, surface ornamentation, and utility. The one that you see here is called mushroos and himroos, which is surface ornamentation and weaving technique. So you will see here that numbers 459 to 525 of mushroom and himroo formed one entire volume. The first edition was published in 1866. There were subsequent revised editions, and the final edition came out in 1874. Now, what Watson also realized that simply giving these textile swatches was not adequate. So he put together another compendium, and one of the key volumes, in my view, which is called The People in Costumes of India, where he lays out the entire strategy. And it is here, while we can talk about the uh, intent that went on behind this compilation, what we frequently miss is how important was this piece of work, and not important only in terms of what it did to India's handloom sector, but if we step back a little and look at it objectively, this work, 18 volumes plus the lead volume, the introductory volume, the People and Costumes of India, is, to my mind, one of the finest documentation we have on Indian textiles, not just in terms of showcasing the skill of Indian craftsmen, but in showing the economic value of India's textiles. And sorry, I think this is something that we don't actually pay enough attention to as researchers and as people working in the space of handlooms and handcrafted textiles. It is here that I think we have lessons to learn from Watson in terms of how well he analyzes every single uh, you know uh, fabric technique, how well documented every single process is, as well as how well every single textile swatch that has been used, all 700, are so well documented in that book. I think we have lessons to learn. And you will see as I move along the slide, the next slide, please. When I said, we will see here what he writes. I read from the book itself. The 700 specimens show what the people of India affect and deem suitable in the way of textile fabrics. And if the supply of these is to come from Britain, they must be imitated there. What is wanted and what is to be copied to meet that want is thus accessible for study in these museums. I think that's an absolute brilliantly put together statement of intent. They're very, very clear that we need to copy these, and if we need to know what to copy, we need to be able to look at it. Hence, these portable industrial museums, as he calls them, he feels would benefit the British manufacturer a great deal. And when we go further down, we will actually see the painstaking efforts they have made to actually catalog every single swatch in such a manner that the manufacturer knows the design flow as well as has an idea of the texture that they are talking about. They get an idea about the dimensions of the original fabric, as well as, very, very importantly, the price. Because at the end of the day, there is an economic intent that overrides everything else. And I must add here that Watson did admire Indian craftsmanship. He does say in several places that there are certain things that Indian can produce best by hand, and that they should not even try and imitate it on the machine. One of them is the Dhaka muslin. He compares, there is a brilliant analysis of the British, French, and Dhaka muslin. And he says there is a reason why the Dhaka muslin is so superior. We should actually not mess with that and try to make it on the machine. So there is an acknowledgement and appreciation for Indian textiles that is very evident. But of course, the economic prosperity of the mills of Britain override that appreciation. Next slide, please. When I say we have a lot to learn from Watson's documentation, there is this paragraph that I would like to read out, and I will tell you why this is very important, is that he writes, in the meantime, the British manufacturer must not look for his customers in the upper 10 millions of India, but to the hundreds of millions in the lower grades. The plainer and cheaper stuffs of cotton, or of cotton and wool together, are those which he has the best chance of selling, and those which he would be able to sell largely if in their manufacture he would keep well in view the requirements and tastes of the people to whom he offers them. I think this is an absolute brilliant, brilliant way of what we call today market orientation and customer targeting, right? This is exactly what we look at in marketing. What am I making? Who is my target audience, and what does my target audience like? What price points work for the target market? So you will see along the 18 volumes that Watson actually categorizes a lot of plain, simple looking fabric, as well as the very, very rich brocades of India, because he says this is the depth and diversity of Indian textiles that the British manufacturer can actually, copy and find customers to sell all of this to. So I think very, very clear that we are not looking at the elite of India. We are looking at the bulk, the middle class, and the lower middle class, because that is how a sustainable business is built. And this is something that we actually have entrepreneurs today struggling with, that we don't know who our target audience is or who our target market is. So, in that sense, I think a lot to pick up from Watson's compilation and his analysis, a very, very clear identification of the target market. And uh, they were clearly doing this not for the next 5 years, 10 years, but they were here for the long haul. And if you look at the amount of textiles compiled and the diversity of textiles, very, very clear that he felt that as British manufacturers made their machines better and better, they would actually be able to tap into richer fabrics and better markets as well. Next slide, please. Like I said, a very, very good analysis of what India was producing. The page that you see actually is a page from where he talks about the silks of India. He gives extremely detailed description of Kasar reeling, especially Bhagalpur Kasar. He talks about the area of Assam and northeast of India. He also talks about the Muga and the mulberry, of course, but this particular image that you see is actually volume number 14, samples number 556 to 294, 560, and again another volume, volume number 8, where he talks of a cotton which has Muga silk on the warp, sample number 294. And if you look at the details that he gives, I will read in case someone's not able to read it. He says cotton with 3/8-inch stripes of Munga silk in the warp, 1/4 inch apart. And, he goes on to give the dimensions, the price, and the provenance. Like I said, I think brilliant, brilliant attention to detail coming in here from the British. And this is not something that Watson was doing single-handedly. We have to remember that when the British East India Company was here buying textiles, this kind of detailed documentation was very, very normal with every textile bought. So we do have instances of British officers buying textiles and giving very detailed descriptions on the kind of dyes used or on the process of how the dye was extracted. Sometimes we do have very good descriptions of how the artisans lived. You have descriptions of the neighborhood in which these cloths were made. So extremely attentive to very fine detail that I think we do not do as well. Again, another leaf to take from their books and learn from. Very, very detailed. So this is exactly how Watson got all his documentation, because all the textiles carried these documentation cards with them, which had a description of the textile swatch, the dimensions, the provenance, the price, and very often we find that, especially say in the case of the kalamkaris that came from Madurai, a very detailed analysis of the kind of red dye that was used and how it was extracted and how it is different from, uh, the dyes, the madder that was used, uh, you know, uh, in other parts of the country. So again, you can see the words Bhagalpur, and what you see in a finer print below is his detailed description of how Bhagalpur Kasar was reeled, and very interesting observations on women reelers, silk reelers, and how poorly paid they were. And nothing has changed even today. Even today, women are the unsung heroes of the handloom value chain, and they still don't get paid as much. But like you see here, very, very detailed description, so that when you look at the swatch, even if the details are missing, you can actually match with the key that is given in this book, and you can identify the sample that is being spoken of. Next slide, please. This is a very, very interesting piece of information, and this is runs into several pages in his book. This is the quantity and value of export of several categories of textiles from India over a 15-year period. Yes. So while the book itself was first published in 1866, clearly the amount of homework that was being done did not go back to the immediate past, but well into 15 years worth of data that they were actually looking at. This particular piece is on the cashmere shawls. You do have very good revenue numbers of India exporting to different parts of Europe. France is a competitor, so very close attention was being paid to how much France was buying. You will have extremely interesting data coming in on how much silk was exported from India, how much cotton was exported. So very, very clearly, this was not something that was thought of overnight. This is extremely well thought out. And I think the reason for its extremely strong impact is the fact that the research goes very, very deep. And I think this is something that policymakers and researchers have to understand, that if we are to create policies that are very strong on impact and have a long lasting impact, our homework needs to run really, really deep. This is 15 years worth of data coming in on cashmere shawls alone. And this is just one page of it. It runs into several pages very obviously. Next slide, please. That's what I mean when I say a product mood board. You can see on your screen that there are two swatches. There is a longer swatch and there is a smaller swatch. The longer rectangular swatch is what was used to show the design flow to the British manufacturer. We have to be very, very conscious of the fact that the British manufacturer has no idea really of how Indians are wearing their textiles. So Watson actually includes a lot of images of Indians in different kinds of clothes, Indians in turbans, female attire, male garments, multiple things. So here in this, you can see that this page is, of course, of the Dhaka muslin with surface embellishment done in Jamdani, as well as extra weft techniques, other extra weft techniques. Uh, the design flow was very, very critical for the British manufacturer to understand the placement of designs. You will see that when he talks of turbans, the design flow looks different. So the manufacturer actually needed to know all of this. The smaller swatch, the square piece that you see, is actually for examination of texture. I would guess that in the original books, they were not completely pasted. They were left open, probably stuck only on one side, so that the manufacturer could actually get a tactile experience of the swatch, so he would understand the kind of texture that is required. And you will see on the top there that he will categorize it as muslin. He will categorize it as muslin, and he will give the dimensions as well as the provenance. The provenance could mean place of manufacturer in most cases, and in some cases, it would mean from where it was purchased. Next, please. And yes, the Asiatic Society of Mumbai is the only place which has all 18 volumes under one roof. We did a show last month at Asiatic, just almost exactly a month ago. And today's session follows through from that. Uh, this again is for surface, for examination of texture, another sample, square swatches. This is the one from the Kashmir, a range of textiles from the pashminas and the wool from Kashmir. Next slide, please. This is a product mood board. I wanted to give you a closer look. If you will look at this, this is a design that we so closely associate with the Paithani today. And, this is a very classic Paithani motif as we would identify today in 2023. What is interesting is in the Watson documentation, this is something that was very commonly done, what he calls loom embroideries, tapestry weaving, commonly done across the Deccan. Three primary centers we identify. One is Hyderabad, one is Aurangabad, and the other is Ahmedabad. There is no mention of Paitan or Maharashtra in specific reference to this particular loom embroidery. But you will see this is a man's garment. This is a turban actually that he talks of. This is in the volume on turbans. You will see the length, width, and weight being given. And the provenance, Aurangabad Deccan, where prices were not available. Obviously, he has not mentioned those, but a lot of them actually come with the mention of prices. So what we identify very closely with Maharashtra and Paitan today, but coming in from different places like Burhanpur, Hyderabad, Aurangabad, and Ahmedabad, the loom embroideries of India. Next slide, please. Like I said, extremely attentive to detail. He sketches, there are sketches, there are illustrations of the different steps of the handloom weaving process, right from, the first stage all the way up to, if you look at this, the warp sizing that is happening and then the weaving that happens. I think for Indian researchers, for practitioners, this kind of documentation is something that is important. But even more important is that customers understand the number of processes that are involved, because every process, it means one livelihood or more. So you have at least 12 to 17 livelihoods being created in the process of making a handloom, which gives an idea of the economic value something like handlooms has. Even today, handlooms is the second largest employer in rural India after agriculture. And agriculture and handlooms form the backbone of India's rural economy. So tremendous impact even today. If we got our act together and our policies right, uh, this is a game changer. 157 years down the line, I think we're in a position to assess the impact of Watson's work, but we're also in a position 157 years later to look at where we have gone wrong probably in the last 75 years and where we need to do a course correction as well. This particular bit, of course, is on the Dhaka muslins, the production process of the Dhaka muslin itself. Next slide, please. Coming to surface ornamentation, this is the mushroom coming in from three places in Watson's catalog. One, of course, is Kutch. The second coming in from Hyderabad, and the third set of samples coming in from Trichy and Tanjore. Mushroom, of course, is a textile that arose to address a specific problem of the Muslims of India, where silk was not allowed to touch the skin of the body. So a textile that actually has cotton on the underside with silk on the surface was created, and that became the mushroom. And what is very interesting to see in Watson's catalog is that you have three distinct kinds of designs coming from these clusters, where Kutch came in with a lot of woven motifs on top. You have the Deccan and what is now Tamil Nadu using a lot of ikat. In fact, in the smaller sample in the thumbnail, you can see a bit of ikat on the thing. Of course, today mushroom is woven only in Gujarat, only in two places in Gujarat, Mandvi and Patan. We do not have mushroom weaving anywhere else in uh, the country at the moment. Next slide, please. Again, another sample of mushroom that uses ikat, these coming in from the south of India. Unfortunate that this tradition has been completely lost. The reason I have included what I have, of course, tried to do is, while I cannot obviously showcase all the images and go into the details of the 18 volumes in a 1 hour session, I've tried to give a sort of a bird's eye view of what is happening, taking care to ensure that I'm able to put a representative set of textiles out where we're able to see traditions that we have lost completely, traditions that we've been able to hold on to in some form, and in some cases, traditions that continue to thrive to a large extent. So I hope this is a little representative. This, of course, coming in from south of India, mushroom, not made anymore in the south of India. Next slide, please. This is the himru. Again, a very fascinating textile that is undergoing a resurgence in terms of textile history and documentation. The himru comes from the word hamru, which means look alike. It was created. Um, it was created to uh, give Muslim aristocracy and nobility a textile that resembled the kinkab that the royals wore. It is said to have come down to Aurangabad uh, via Muhammad bin Tughlaq when he moved his capital during his infamous journey from Delhi to Daulatabad. He brought with him a lot of craftsperson, and when he returned to Delhi, a lot of them stayed back. But what happened with these craftsmen was that while they were experts in weaving the kinkab and brocades for royalty, the main customer had now disappeared. And Muslim aristocracy and nobility, by protocol, would not wear what royals wore. So they had to get a fabric that looked like the kinkab, but was not the kinkab. So you have the birth of Himru in Aurangabad in absolutely splendid design and workmanship of the like that we do not see today. Um, After all these years, we had a bit of Himru weaving during Suraya past time in Hyderabad. We do have samples coming in, of course, from again Madras, Hyderabad, and Aurangabad in Watson's catalog. Uh, as of 2023 in India, we have about 6 looms in Aurangabad by the Qureshis who set up Himru weaving in Aurangabad. They continue to weave the Himru in its original technique. The designs, of course, are far simpler today, but this is one of the Himru swatches that has been documented in Watson's catalog. Next, please. These are samples of the kinkabs and brocades. I will have to mention here that kinkabs and brocades occupy 2 volumes, and he does not actually categorize them as Kanjivarams and Banarsis the way we would today. But judging by the provenance, I would wager a guess that a lot of them come from down south. They come from Ahmedabad, where the original brocade was woven, as well as the Banaras clusters. You have a lot coming from Ahmedabad in Watson's catalog and a lot again from the south of India. The Ashavali is still woven near Ahmedabad, fewer looms, only one family doing it, but nevertheless woven. The Ashavali is considered to be the original brocade of India. And we do have some stunning samples in Watson's catalog coming in from Ahmedabad. Next slide, please. As you can see, I think for me, the personal favorite would be the one right in the center coming in from Benares. Very interesting design language that we get to see because uh, if this was not part of Watson's catalog and this image just popped up, we would think of this as very contemporary, very modern, and very quirky kind of a design. But all the way 200-year-old sample coming up from Benares, that's absolutely, I think, very quirky in design, very appealing. So clearly, Indians did have very evolved taste back then. And I have a special word for the men in the audience coming up. So please do stay tuned to that. But some stunning samples of brocade coming in Watson's catalog from across India, specifically Ahmedabad, Benares, and the south of India. Next, please. The piece de resistance now coming to muslin. Muslin is probably one of the sadder stories we have of India's textile history and the long history of cotton itself. Uh, Dhaka muslin was famed all over the world, of course, and Indian muslin, of course, known as abrawan or woven air. It is believed that at one point, India was weaving muslin that was of at least 1700, 1800 count, making it so sheer that it looked like you were not wearing anything, even if you had 7 or 10 layers wrapped around yourself. What is very interesting, and I have to point out here that when we look at Watson's book, we have to read it in conjunction with a parallel survey that was done, which was the Agricultural Survey of India. Now, it was all one thing to have all of this manufactured elsewhere, but for this, Britain needed to have a sustainable long term source of cotton, the kind of cotton that would be compatible with the spinning mills. And India was wearing khadi, right? So you have short, medium staple yarn coming in that was hand spun and hand woven into cloth. And what the mills needed was slightly longer staple cotton. So agricultural and farming practices had to change if cotton was to be grown the way the UK mills needed it to be grown. So you have a shift in agricultural patterns happening. And this particular cotton, Karakapas, which is growing along the banks of the river Padma in what was undivided Bengal back then, eventually gave way to cotton that was more conducive to the spinning mills. But you will see here that these are, of course, the Watson's catalog has muslins and calicos documented. You have plain weave muslins like the one on the larger thumbnail that you can see. As you can see, very, very finely hand spun cloth over here, hand spun and hand woven yarn cloth. And on the right is the fabled Jamdani of undivided Bengal. Stunning, stunning samples. I don't think pictures will ever do justice. When you look at the actual sample, it's jaw-droppingly beautiful. We do have a lot of muslin samples as well with single thread hand embroidery done on them, including chikankari, which they said was used for making frocks for children or children's clothes because of how light it looked. So obviously very, very ethereal fabric. And Watson goes on to give a very, very technical analysis of why Dhaka muslin cannot be, replaced with anything else on the machine, because he says the magic in the craftsperson's hand can never be replicated on a machine. So next, please. Like I said, single thread embroidery on the left, you have embroidery on the left, and you have Jamdani again coming up, supplementary weft technique coming in from undivided Bengal. This seems to be an older sample than the other one. It's so fine, in fact, that a lot of people who actually saw this at the Asiatic show refused to believe this was woven, and they kept thinking it was printed because it was so fine. So extremely beautiful samples of muslin and calico coming in Watson's catalog from undivided Bengal. The other textile that gets extensive documentation from undivided Bengal is the silk from Murshidabad in his volume on silks. Next, please. Because we are from Bombay, and this is an absolutely stunning story coming from Bombay, is that Thane, which we know today for a host of other reasons, was actually a hub for silk weaving. It is said that even way back, Thane was exporting silk, and the papal vestments were made of Thana silk. In fact, a lot of Arab travelers have mentioned this fabric called Tanasi, which we assume is Thana silk. They would come specifically to buy this particular silk and take it back with them because it fetched a very high price. What is very interesting is that Thana silk actually does not get adequate documentation in the Indian documentation of Indian textiles. The only samples, actual physical samples we see of Thana silk are in Watson's catalog. There are over half a dozen samples that we see, and each one of them, if you look at the surface ornamentation, the weaving techniques done, I think very, very reminiscent of the Khana of North Karnataka, possibly indicating that the weaver migration paths came from North Karnataka into Maharashtra. And there is also, of course, other supplementary evidence that there is to indicate that uh, weavers from North Karnataka actually migrated into Maharashtra and were weaving cottons as well for Goa and Maharashtra, primarily because of the similarity in design languages of the North Karnataka cottons, the Goan Kunbi kapod, as well as the Lugda, the East Indians of Bombay wear. But that's a topic for another day. This is silk from Thana, absolutely stunning samples in Watson's catalog, and one very clearly indicating that Thana was a hub of silk weaving even up to, say, about 100 years ago, possibly. You have a lot of Muslim and Christian weavers. It is said that a lot of them moved into Bombay to work in the mills once the demand for Thana silk dropped. A lot of them moved to Bombay to work in the spinning mills, leading to a complete closure of the weaving cluster in Thana. Next, please. Again, silk from Thana. I think very, very complex weaving techniques, very intricate, displaying a very, very high level of skill over here by Thana weavers, mostly Muslim weavers, the Koshti weavers as they were called. Next, please. These were turban samples. I have put a few on the left and few on the right. You have three primary kinds. Of course, you have the tie and dye techniques of Bandhani, Leheria being showcased here, as well as the woven techniques coming in from Chanderi and Banaras. Uh, what is very interesting in the Watson catalog is, in order to help the British manufacturer understand the layout of the turban, especially if you look on the right, he would, the wherever possible, textile swatches were attached, and on the facing page, sketches were made of the entire turban, the top end and the bottom end, so that the manufacturer knew how to border the two ends of the turban. And this gave an idea of the leheria, you will see here, the bandhani, the sungadi in some cases, as well as woven techniques coming from Banaras, the loom embroideries coming in from Aurangabad and Burhanpur, and a lot of turban material coming in from Chanderi. Very interestingly, Chanderi coming in with some plain weave turbans, and the lowest priced turban was from Chanderi, the most expensive one coming in from Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu with very, very fine quality zari work. Next, please. Woolens get documented, two full volumes of them coming in from Watson's catalog. Woolens from across the country, across the subcontinent, from Kulu, from Darjeeling, from Ladakh. You have a lot coming in from what is Pakistan today, a lot from Bhutan and Tibet as well. Again, the same, you have a longer swatch showing the design flow and a smaller swatch for surface ornamentation. Very interesting samples coming in from what is now Pakistan. Very, very interesting samples coming in, as well as the documentation of what is called the Kambli of Karnataka, or the Gondri of Maharashtra, what the shepherds would wear, the classic black one, also gets documented in Watson's catalog. That's a very interesting sample, because that is probably, wool is the only place where probably textiles used by the indigenous people of India actually get documented. The one big category Watson actually does not document is the textiles of India's indigenous people. Multiple reasons, of course. One is they were never an item of export, so probably samples were not there. Second, they were not seen as appealing enough to be replicated. Of course, they came loaded with social significance, and indigenous textiles carry a lot of social identity markers, anthropological markers within them. So probably not an area of interest, because of which Watson actually almost exclusively leaves out the northeast of India. There are only 4 or 5 samples coming in from Assam. One is of Muga being used, the yarn being used as embroidery yarn. And in the other, there are some samples of plain silk coming in from Guwahati. But by and large, the the northeast of India actually gets left out of Watson's catalog. And this again is important because when we come to the last slide, we will actually be able to assess the impact better. Next, please. Choli cloths of India. Very interesting categorization. Again, a throwback to among the earlier slides where he talked about identifying the customer base and the target market. The choli cloth was becoming an important fabric for the women of India. Uh, very detailed, very ornamental choli cloths that you find coming from across the country. This one is from the south of India, the piece in red. The one on the right is from Rajasthan. Very different, but very ornamental. Clearly, women were buying as they do today. Very, very high quality choli cloths. Blouses remained important back then as they do today. So there's an entire volume dedicated to the choli cloths, which means that this particular customer segment was evidently seen as one that was very important and one that could earn a lot of revenue. Next. This is the last slide. And when I said we will look at the northeast of India here, if you look at the number, this is from the 4th handloom census, you will see that the largest is in Assam with 12.69 lakh weaver households. You will see the clear difference over here. The northeast of India even today has the highest number of weaving households. They do weaving on a regular basis. Women know how to weave, even if they do not weave commercially all of the time. Women wear handlooms even today, especially in rural Assam, rural Northeast India, uh, which is not the case in the rest of the country. So if you map Watson's catalog and this particular 4th handloom census with a gap of 157 years, all the textiles that Watson actually documents, all the regions that he documents so carefully are the ones that have a huge fall in weaving and weaver households. The ones that got excluded to a large extent are the ones that still have a lot of weaving. And if you look at Bengal with 5.42 lakh, it's interesting that all of these weavers actually are more for handloom and not for muslin. Spinners in West Bengal showing a marked decline. Handloom weaving in West Bengal, of course, continuing with a lot of clusters around Fulia, Shantipur, Murshidabad, Bishnupur, etc. Silk and cotton being woven. But again, the target in Watson's catalog as far as Bengal was concerned was only the muslin. And today, we do not actually have muslin to that extent in Bengal. What we have, of course, is a very shrunken part of it. And you will find that almost this entire part that you see in yellow, if you go back and overlap it with Watson's catalog, these are regions that are extensively documented in Watson's textile samples. So I think the impact of his book is very, very evident in this map. That 157 years later, this is where India stands 75 years after independence and 157 years after Watson's book was published. This is where India actually stands. You look at Maharashtra, we have among the lowest number of weavers at 3,435, followed only by Goa and Punjab with 26 and 936. And even Sikkim has a very low number, really. But this gives an idea of what actually the impact of Watson's book was. And going back to the first slide that we actually spoke about, the strategy was very, very clear. What is our problem? Our problem is that India is not buying anything from us. What should we sell to India? Let us sell them cloth because we have our mills that need to be worked on. They need to be doubled. How are we going to do that? Is that we document all the textiles that Indians are wearing and we replicate them on the machines and sell it back to Indians at a cheaper rate, because he very clearly writes that there can hardly be an Indian who will not fall for the temptation of buying cloth when offered at a cheaper price. And he says India is a kind of market that even if they clothe only 1% of India, the looms in Lancashire would double in no time. So this is a very, very clear, well thought out strategy, and one that 75 years after independence that we could actually do well to pay very close attention to and see what of that documentation, what kind of research that has been put out there, what kind of details have, what kind of data has been mined would be very, very useful for policymakers today. And I think that is where we lack, that we do not have uh, the kind of in-depth research that the British seem to have had. We are not analyzing the data on hand as well as we should be doing. Perhaps that is where we actually need to look at. So while I know the instinct is to obviously blame Watson for destroying Indian handlooms, and perhaps, yes, it's an act of vandalism in a sense to actually cut up textile swatches and stick them in books. The question that we now need to sit back and ask is, what do we do now? What is India going to do next? And how are we going to do this next? So I think with this, I want to end the presentation here and open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Savitha. That was truly delightful, and the extent of research that Watson did in putting together is mind-boggling. And of course, the extent of research that you have done on it is also so commendable. So thank you for bringing it to us in such a compact, clear format. I know that you have a great collection yourself of some of these, your personal collection of weaves. Do you want to tell us for a couple of minutes about your process of how you've gone about it? And then I'll read the questions out to you.
Yeah, I'll just go to, of course, Bessie Sissel is here. So I think we have the best of people out here. Her work on Watson's catalog is phenomenal, of course. And thank you, Bessie.
You go, Savitha. You want to put on your video?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Bess. We don't have any of the 3 copies that were meant for the Indian textile diaspora. Vandana, we don't have, the copies are scattered. Like I said earlier, Asiatic Mumbai is the only place where we have the entire collection under one roof. And that was the basis of the show I curated last month as well. Copies are scattered. Some are in private hands. Some are, of course, at Bhaudaji Lal Museum has a couple. Victoria in Calcutta has a few. There are copies scattered across the country, but Shattuck is the only place I know of that has all 18 under one roof.
Would you tell us a little bit about your journey as well in terms of collecting and documenting this? And then I'll go on to the questions.
Yeah, so what actually happened was my own tryst with Watson was exciting because, of course, it's impossible to not to be in handlooms and not know about his work. So there has, of course, been that thing. And there is, of course, a museum in UK that has digitized the entire thing. And this is a question that I get asked very often. Is Asiatic going to digitize the documents? Of course, digitized archives are available on the net. You can Google and it's very easy to look. But it's here that I want to talk about the importance of having the books preserved as they are by people, by institutions like Asiatic, is because this is the only chance we have at actually having a tactile experience of textiles that are over 160, 200 years old. I think for textile researchers, for revivalists, for designers who wish to work on these, this is a treasure. So it's equally important that the books are maintained as they are today so that textile swatches could actually be used to recreate textiles again today by those who wish to in a very authentic, ethical manner. So yes, digitization is great because it helps preserve the content. But I think for India, now is the time we should actually start looking at how do we actually preserve the books as they are, and 2, how do we get people to actually recreate from these books in an ethical, authentic manner. Coming back to how I got involved with Watson was that I am a research scholar with Asiatic. And when I was looking up for material on my own research on the traditional textiles of the Eastern Indian community of Bombay, I was whining about how little there is on the indigenous textiles, of the city. And there's this casual mention that, oh, we have this book, something called Watson in our rare book archives. And for me, it was like the gates of heaven had just opened. And I said, and they're like, do you want to see them? And I'm like, of course, like 18 volumes all in one place. It's absolute paradise. The doors of paradise had opened. And when we brainstormed on that and we said, they said, what do you want to do with it? And of course, we brainstormed for several months and we went back and forth, and we eventually did the show last month where the books were out on public display for the first time, 6 books at a time. We tried changing them every day to include as much as we could. We curated a set of textiles, contemporary textiles that were cataloged in Watson's, just to give an idea to people about uh, what you see in the book and what do you see today, so that they get a tactile experience as well as first-hand experience of how much have we lost, how much have we managed to hold on to, and how much have we reinvented. Because there is a lot of work that goes on in say brown cotton, in bringing back indigenous cotton. Khamir is one of the biggest success stories we have in the country. We have Karangani cotton of Tamil Nadu coming back. We have brown cotton in Karnataka. So there are several things that are going on in the background which are away from the spotlight. And we thought the Asiatic show would be a good time to actually showcase lesser known work that is happening in handlooms. Uh, for the Northeast, of course, we curated a set of photographs and portraits where we hoped that showcased the traditional techniques that were still being used in Northeast, relatively untouched as opposed to the rest of the country, in terms of, say, the takli being used to spin airy yarn, in terms of weaving happening on a daily basis, in terms of how people wear handlooms and go about comfortably around their day-to-day activities, whether they're fishing or they're selling tea at a tourist spot. But how women in the Northeast actually take ownership of the weaving processes, and they're also, wear what they weave. So we thought the Northeast would get included as a very, very positive story coming out of India, as well as a note of caution that if we don't protect what we have in the Northeast, we could well go down the way the rest of the country has gone. So that is what we did through the Asiatic show. Stunning response, of course. Very, very happy to see Mumbaikars turn out in huge numbers for the show. Amazing number of walkthroughs, unprecedented for us. And of course, we had a lot of practitioners coming in from across the country as well to see the books, because that was really, really rare to see all the books out at one time. Yeah. So if I
One.
could.
So going back to the initial book, how long did this compendium take, Watson, and how many people do you reckon were involved in
Uh,
that project?
I would reckon hundreds were involved, directly and indirectly. The exact numbers are something I would not hazard a guess, because it simply says, Watson takes the credit, but evidently worked with the team. The books were commissioned in the late 1850s and first published in 1866, with next editions coming all the way up to 1874. So this was work in progress very clearly. And as and when they had updates to put out, they brought out newer volumes, or samples that had to be changed were changed. So there would be possibly that some samples would be different in what we have at Asiatic vis-a-vis something else that we see on an online archive. There could be those differences, but broadly speaking, the categorization remains the same. 18 volumes broken down based on fabric, surface ornamentation, and utility. So when I say utility, it would mean the toli cloths, it would mean turbans, men's garments as well. Fabric would mean the silk, muslins, calicos, woolens. Surface ornamentation would include the himrus, the mushrooms, the kinkabs and the brocades, as well as the embroideries of India. Kashmir gets extensively documented, the embroideries, because at some point they felt that these are designs that could be done on the jacquard and, could be replicated on the machine.
Before we move on to the other question, I have one more question, which is to say,
Yeah.
has the length of the sari changed over time?
Yes, of course. While we tend to think that the 6 yard is the most common, of course, it is the most common now. We have to remember that India has had several draping styles. The nivi that you see today, which is the most popular way of wearing a sari, is relatively recent in the timeline of India wearing the Indian women wearing the unstitched fabric. So draping styles largely dependent on the social strata the woman came from and the occupation she was involved in. So, if you look at the Kunbi kapod, for instance, what the farm laborers of Goa were wearing, that's a 5 yard fabric which was worn hitched at the knee, so that when they went into the paddy fields, the cloth was actually not in the water. It was above, at the knee level or just above the knee. But if you come down to the Peshwai kind of drape, you have it going well below the ankle. Again, you will see in some East Indian communities of Bombay, the draping style goes a little below the ankle, and we actually have Lugda samples that are as long as 11 yards. So you have the Navari that the Maharashtrians wear, you have the Madisar that South India wears.
Yeah.
Andhra has a 7 yard drape. It's a 7 yard sari. So you have different drapes depending on what women were doing in their daily life. So yes, the length of the sari has changed, and we must also remember that there are vast sections of the country where the sari is not the traditional textile. The entire Northeast, for instance, or the western part of the country where the sari is not their traditional textile, but we generally tend to equate the sari as something that's just pan Indian, but it's not actually so.
So, Vandana, I had a question.
Yeah.
If we don't have the three copies, but I think that was quickly responded to, and
I can
you did
I
mention to
can see
forward.
something from
Yes.
Keyur on the Gulbadan. Yes, the Gulbadan is extensively documented in Watson's catalog. Some beautiful samples that I will be happy to share on my Instagram account if you're going to follow it later is some beautiful samples of the Gulbadan being documented from the south of India, from the Deccan. So you could look up my Instagram account. Perhaps tomorrow I will be putting out a few of those images. Renu says, where does the sari emerge from and the word? Uh, Plenty of theories around this. So I think I will just leave that for Google, and there is enough documentation on the sari. What's interesting in the Watson's documentation is that while today the association with handlooms and sari and women is a linear association. The moment you say handlooms, we say, oh, women in saris. The truth was something else. And this is where I want to address the men, if there are any left in the audience today, that Watson has 2 volumes on cotton trousering material. And I have to say that Indian men were far cooler back then. The colors they were wearing, the designs they were wearing, I think fabulous. I have seen some lovely oranges, neon pinks, hot pinks, peaches, yellows, and very, very good surface ornamentation, weaving, woven motifs done, as well as, of course, plain cotton trouser material. In fact, very interestingly, a lot of trouser material from Kurla mills of Bombay also being documented, probably indicating that they were not just looking at our handlooms, they were also looking at what our mills were able to make. So, very interesting documentation. Um, Turbans, choli cloths, cotton trouser material, very clear that the handloom sector is not gender specific. Men were wearing handlooms back then. Y'all stopped wearing sometime after the Swadeshi movement died out and India got independence. And somewhere National Handloom Day became about women wearing saris. Nothing could be further than the truth. Any knitted structures apart from woven fabrics? No, we don't actually see any knitted fabrics in Watson's catalog. The bulk of it really is just woven fabrics. A lot of wool coming in, like I said, from Afghanistan, from Karachi, from Lahore, from Bhutan, Burma, beautiful textile woolens coming in, but no knitted fabrics as far as I recall. Can't imagine
Lakshmi,
the Indian men of yesteryear. Oh, you have to see it to believe it. I could spend a lifetime telling the men to upgrade their wardrobe. They really need to get cooler.
Lakshmi Nair says that Ayam Patte still has the kutni or the mushroom as far as
Putty
she
and much, not to the extent that we see. The iron plate itself is a revival weave now, and you know, it the scale would also matter. The affordability, the scale, considering that they had enough to cut up and put across 20 sets speaks of how much textile of that time would have been available and the designs. So I would think we're really very narrow. And I don't think the iron plate is something that is very popular in the Indian handloom thing right now. It's seen as a micro revival. So I will reserve judgment on whether that can be, talked of mushroom still being done. Typically, when we say mushroom, we talk of active weaving of mushroom, which is there only in Patan and Mandvi currently in a big way.
GK mentions that Gujarat, most of them still use modal silk as their base and not mulberry silk. It's a comment.
Modal silk is again, that is true. It is true because it's for cost effectiveness. But I have to say here that back then, at least if you look at Watson's catalogs, it's all mulberry silk. So what happens now is about, how India has adapted again, a story of how India has learned to do without certain things and innovate itself or use things that are most uh, easily available or more cost effective. You talked about South Asian dyes being documented by the British. Could you give specific examples? Yes, of course. There's a very, very interesting a paragraph I read when I was reading up about the Nayaka Kalamkari. We have the Srikalahasti Kalamkari and you have the Pedana Kalamkari, the Machilipatnam, and you have the Nayaka Kalamkari. And in that particular documentation, and I could share that at some point, is there's a very detailed description on the extraction of the red dye from local sources and a specific mention to the Vaigai River, which actually adds to the particular shade of red that was being used to create the background in Nayaka Kalamkari in Madurai. So very beautifully explained, the extraction process as well as how it is different from the madder that was being used in other parts of the country. So I find generally that when the British or when Europeans have been writing about Indian textiles, this is not something that they've just been writing off the cuff, but a very, very interesting documentation of the processes that go on behind the cloth itself. Like in one case, I remember them writing that this is that they bought a particular kalamkari textile from an artist who lived on the street where there were two temples, one being a bigger one and one being a smaller one. And his house was small and had a sloping roof. So I think there's tremendous amounts that we could actually learn from that kind of documentation that has been going on, because this is simply fabulous anthropological ethnographic documentation. So I think it's very, very interesting for researchers and people working in the space today to actually learn from.
Harshvardhan Nakra would like to know which are the best books to have a glimpse today that are available in print today for the textiles of India. So maybe you can mention some of yours as well.
Um, so one of the books that we consider the Bible, especially if you're looking at saris, is of course Rita Kapoor Trishti's Saris, Traditions and Beyond. It does not, of course, cover the Northeast because, like I said, the sari is not part of the Northeast traditional textiles, but a very, very well put together book. If you want on Assam's, then a book that I co-authored is available. It's the only one in the country today that documents the 13 tribes of Assam and their traditional textiles, as well as the textile history of these 13 tribes. Of course, there are books, fabulous books by Jasleen Dhamija on the Balucharis. So I have to point out here that uh, this conversation is going to get interesting. When I have to give a list of books that we could refer to, my list would run into about 50 or 60 books that I would say, read this for Baluchari, read this for Chikankari, read this for Pashmina. What's interesting is that even today, Watson's is the only compendium we have that is as exhaustive as it is. That if there's one place I have to go to and look at almost the entirety of India's textiles, I would find them in Watson's. It is not representative of everything India made, but fairly exhaustive. And considering that we don't have an equivalent compendium today, I think speaks volumes for how important Watson's collection of books is.
And how do we now make this together is, I guess, the challenge that we're all thinking in our minds. Create one compendium of today's times, which I'm sure needs both funding and dedicated.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what we really need to look at is learning of my big takeaway from Watson's is that the pen really is mightier than the sword. They brought an entire sector down on its knees based on the written word. I think we really need to keep that in mind. And those of us working in the sector, I think, um, owe it to ourselves and to the people who walked this path before us and those who are going to come after us, that we start collaborating extensively. That we all see ourselves as incredible parts of the handloom value chain in whatever capacity we are working in. Whether we are enablers, we are customers, look at Watson. He understands the Indian customer so well. And he tells them that this is not something you would probably wear, but remember, this is what your customer is wearing, and it's your duty to make what your customer wants. I think a lot of lessons that we actually need to learn, which is why I was so intent on saying that let's not call it the destructive thing. Let's change the way we look at Watson's collection and maybe work on more collaborative exercises where we're able to put together this. We have a tremendous amount of textile wisdom in the country through the length and breadth of the country. We have living heritages, living encyclopedias in the form of our master craftsmen. I think now is when we start putting all of our strengths together and saying, okay, we take ownership of what we have. I think that, yes, Vandana says, I have an exhaustive Excel sheet for textile books, which is constantly updated. For those in Bombay, my books may be borrowed. So if you look at something on the list and you want a book, feel free to reach out. My books are available for borrowing, provided you take care of them, more care than you would of your children. I'm very, very possessive about my books, but I do realize that it may not be possible for everyone to be buying those books, or there's no need to really. So please feel free to borrow from the things. Would you say involvement of designers today helps or hinders our traditions? That's a loaded question, one that could easily get me short. I will include, this goes 50-50. It depends on really um, uh, who takes credit. Of course, the designer does take bulk of the credit today for putting together all of this. But I do think that far more credit needs to be given to our craftsperson. Far more credit needs to be given to textile researchers. There's some amazing textile research going on in the country, and I find that designers really need to collaborate more with the academicians in the textile sector, so we're able to put out more authentic stories of these textiles rather than something that sounds more like marketing lingo that's going to help them make money off the textile.
What I really love is when you wear a piece of, or buy a piece of fabric, and it has the name of the artist also woven in it. I feel when I buy that I have a direct connect with the weaver, and that the
True.
weaver gets that recognition every time I wear it, because I can
It's true.
identify who the weaver is. So if that were a tradition,
That's,
I think.
that's one part of it, but that would be the lowest hanging fruit that we are picking on.
Sure, sure.
Just to put things in context, um, over 65% of, say, Maharashtra's weavers, for instance, earn less than 5,000 rupees a month. So we're really looking at policies. Why is it that despite everything that we have, and we acknowledge that India is the only country with this kind of diversity and depth of textile heritage, why are we not able to do better? And I think COVID showed us, where really our artists were. And a lot of what we said and did perhaps just stayed as lip sympathy. I think really, books like the Watsons would be very useful in understanding how to make policies that will actually have a long-term impact. And someone asked how many fabrics documented in the compendium have we lost? We have lost a lot. There's been a loss of skill. Watson, in fact, does not see this as de-skilling. He says the population of weavers who are thus no longer weaving will then be gainfully employed to create infrastructure that India now needs. So it means they're accepting that once handloom weaving takes a hit, there will be a migration to the cities, and that is not seen as a loss, but rather seen as a more productive use of their skills and their time. So we have lost skills. We have lost a lot of technique. We've lost a lot of textile traditions, right? But I think the biggest loss India has had are the stories. Indian textiles come with stories. Every single motif, Ikat from Telangana will speak one story. Ikat from Odisha tells you a story. Ikat from Gujarat will tell you a story. I think what happened in the past 150 years is that a lot of these stories, we lost a lot of them. We lost the nuances because Indian textiles are not just things we clothed ourselves with. These were stories of our community that made the clothes, communities that wore the clothes, how we wore them, when we wore them, why we wore them. These things mattered. I think what India does not realize is this loss of intangible heritage is far deeper than we would believe. So I think that is a far greater loss. And what has happened because of that is that while we've lost them, some of them forever, the stories, and it's going to be a long haul to get them back. The other is it has opened the floodgates to a lot of false narratives being put out by those with an agenda. So I think that again is something that does not augur well for the sector. Are there any British manufactured textiles in Indian archives that show evidence of British textiles coming in over this period? There is evidence not so much of a textile swatch, but Watson himself, when he talks, compares British muslin, French muslin, and Dhaka muslin, he says the superior quality of Dhaka muslin comes from the sizing and starching processes. And he says this is why muslin coming in from the mills of Britain catches mildew. There is actually an entire page where they talk about the problems with cotton coming in from Britain, that, it is catching mildew, it is not as durable as they expected it to be, or that it is not as good as the Indian muslin. So there is an acknowledgement, of course, that they are sending cotton cloth to us, and that it's not as good as what India is able to make. Do we have any ancient texts in our own heritage that deal with the textile arts? There are, of course, books. There are, of course, books. I think the problem for us really is not that there is no literature. The problem is in accessing the literature, because we are a country that speaks multiple languages, a lot of them written in languages that are not spoken now or not widely understood now. So we have a long way to go before we're actually able to translate all of that. But yes, you do have a lot of Sanskrit literature talking of plant fiber textiles, including the balkala, that people who went into the forest wore, or flaxseed fiber, hemp fiber. So yes, plenty of textiles that talk about it, not just in Sanskrit, but a lot of regional languages as well. There's
Lovely.
something on Gorang that I saw. I was trying to
Gorang,
get.
Gorang said in a different forum that it comes down to how open our persons are to innovate or to act
Uh,
change.
yes, in a way, he is right. Because why does the Indian craftsperson not innovate or accept change? One is, of course, the fact that there is insecurity about the livelihood itself. If I'm not sure where my next meal is going to come from, I don't want to experiment. I'm going to be play safe and do the tried and tested method. But if there is a promise of adequate financial reward or remuneration that can be sustainable, we have seen our Indian craftsperson innovate fabulously. So it all will boil down to the way we perceive our textiles. And again, I will go back to Watson, that the reason it is so important is that they were able to show the economic value of our textiles. What India needs to do is look again at the economic value of our textiles and see how far this percolates down the value chain, so we make it worth their time to stay in the sector.
Keyur says that there's a lot of text in the manuscripts as
Yes,
well. And
yes, there is. There
lovely.
is a lot actually. Yeah.
Before we wind down, would you like to share your Instagram handle with people? Because I know a lot of people would
Yeah,
like to follow
yeah.
you.
It's Savitha.Suri on Instagram, same on Facebook as well. So for those here, my books, I will be putting the list out next week of the books. So you could look through that and reach out to me if something interests you and you could borrow as well. Uh, there is also an album called Textile Resource Album on my Facebook thing. It's a public setting. You could actually look through that. And if you have queries on any textile, please feel free to reach out as well. Happy to answer any queries on that. And I will remember to put the Gulbadan textile images, Keyur. I have not forgotten. I will do that. Which book is the best to have a glimpse of textiles? Harshvardhan. I've already answered that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here today. It was an
Thank you.
incredible honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here this evening. And it was such an interesting talk. We'd all like to follow you and, keep understanding more about the handloom
Thank you.
traditions of the
Thank you
country.
so much.
And all power to our weavers for making
Thank you
things.
so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone for joining this Saturday evening. We'll see you next week.